Right. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. So we are here to speak about the Wayland Rudd Collection. And sitting next to me is Professor Yevgeniy Fiks from Mercer County Community College. And in a moment, I will introduce our other two guests. But bear with me today. I'm working a solo on the cameras. So, right now it's just Yevgeniy and I. I'm Michael Jovin-Dalton, in case you don't know. So I'm going to just introduce the show and Yevgeniy, and then I actually am going to switch cameras, and I'll introduce our other two guests as well. So the JKC Gallery is honored to present an important collaborative and historical collection of work that was organized by Mercer's Professor of Art, Yevgeniy Fiks. Yevgeniy is known for his research and curation with a focus on forgotten and unresolved Cold War narratives. In 2010, he began collecting artwork and media produced in the Soviet Union between the 1920s and the 1980s testifying to the Soviet Union's engagement with race relations in the United States and decolonization efforts in Africa. This work became known as the Wayland Rudd Collection, which is not only a historical collection of Soviet-era imagery, but is also a foundation for invited contemporary artists and scholars to make work in response to this collection. And we actually have with us a scholar and an artist who you will see in a moment. So Yevgeniy Fiks was born in Moscow in 1972 and has lived and worked in New York since 1994. His works address the Red and Lavender Scares during the McCarthy era, communism in modern art, and African, African-American, and Jewish diasporas in the Soviet Union. Fiks's work has been shown internationally. This includes exhibitions in the United States at Winkleman and Postmasters galleries, both in New York, MoCA, and the Philadelphia Museum of Art, the Moscow Museum of Art, and Marat Guelman Gallery in Moscow. I hope I said that right. Sala de Arte, Público, Siqueiros in Mexico City. I shouldn't have tried to pronounce that correctly. And the Museu Colecção Berardo in Lisbon. Wow, I didn't realize. All right, so give me 1 second. All right. This is what I've been doing all by myself. Yeah, you guys are on camera right now. Okay, so to Yevgeniy's left, Maxim Matutsevich is a professor of history at Seton Hall University, where he directs the Russian and East European Studies program. He is the author of No Easy Row for a Russian Hoe, Ideology and Pragmatism in Nigerian-Soviet Relations, 1960-1991, Africa World Press, and editor of Africa in Russia, Russia in Africa, 3 Centuries of Encounters, Africa World Press. He is currently writing on the history of African-American sojourns in the Soviet Union. His short stories and novellas have appeared in the Kenyon Review, New England Review, the Bear Life Review, and other publications. Welcome.
Thank you.
And Kara Lynch is a time-based artist living in the Bronx, New York. Was born in the auspicious year of 1968. Ambivalent towards hypervisual culture, she is curious about duration, embodiment, and the oral. Through collective practice and social intervention, she explores aesthetic, political relationships between time and space. Her work is vigilantly raced, classed, and gendered. Black, Indigenous, immigrant, anarchist, queer, and feminist. Welcome, Kara.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I am now going to get behind the cameras, hand it off to Professor Fiks here, and we'll get started.
Thank you so much, Michael, for the introductions, and it's great to be here at the JKC Gallery. And I'm very happy, Michael, that we can have the Wayland Rudd Collection here. So it's been shown a few times since 2013. It's been shown in the U.S. at several university galleries, at several private galleries, and in some forums, it's been presented also abroad in different exhibitions. So this project, the Wayland Rudd Collection, it started around 2010, but prior to coming to this topic, representation of internationalism in the Soviet visual culture, I made several projects on the history of American communism, and that was around 2005, 2007. So I painted portraits of American communists, present-day American communists, circa 2005 to 2007. Then there was another project. So the portraiture project was called Communist Party USA. So it was portraits of members of CPUSA, American Communist Party, in early 21st century. And around this time, there was another project called Communist Guide to New York City, which was a series of photographs of buildings, public spaces in Manhattan with the history of American communism. And it came out as a little guidebook with photographs and captions around 2008. So what I discovered through those projects on the history of American communism, I discovered that the story of American communism and the history of African American communities overlap in many, complex and sometimes contradictory ways. So certainly there were a lot of African American individuals among my sitters when I worked on the portraiture projects, portraits of American communists. And then as I was discovering the history of American communism through working around Manhattan and photographing American buildings and public places in Manhattan with American history, I also, at the same time, those were sides of African American history. So this overlap between African American history and history of American communism is something that I guess stumbled upon while working on those two projects that I just mentioned. So, and around 2010, in the summer of 2010, I was reading this article about the relationship between W.E.B. Du Bois's late novels and socialist realism. And kind of at that point, I felt, okay, I want to look at how Soviet culture, how Soviet visual culture and Soviet artists addressed representation of African Americans in Soviet art, in Soviet visual art. And that's how, I guess, this project, the Wayland Rudd project, was born. And in the summer of 2010, I started collecting images made by Soviet artists between 1920s and 1980s, representing African American struggle, African American daily life, and also I saw a lot of images, found a lot of images devoted to the 1960s in Africa and decolonization efforts in Africa. So I started collecting these Soviet images, and I've collected over the years about 300. Some are digital images, and some are physical posters and postcards, and some figurines, and some postal stamps, and some brochures, illustrated books. So it's a large kind of body of work. It's historical work produced between 1920s and 1930s by very different artists, working in different periods of Soviet history. In 1920s, you see specific visual styles that then would change in 1930s. Then I would see very different images from 1960s and the 70s and 80s. So in a way, so these images, Soviet images representing African and African American life and struggles were kind of mirroring the development of Soviet art history, right? The development of Soviet art. And what happened then is, so around 2012, I felt that I've collected these images. It's very interesting material, but there is a limit to how I can engage with it. So I certainly have my post-Soviet optics. I was educated as an artist in the former Soviet Union, late Soviet time, but the issues are complex that the Wayland Rudd Collection presents. So I had to involve others. But I also want to mention here is Wayland Rudd, right? The collection is called the Wayland Rudd Collection, and Wayland Rudd was an African-American actor who moved to the Soviet Union in early 1930s and spent the rest of his life in the Soviet Union and died of natural causes in the Soviet Union in 1952. So when I started working initially on this project, I was just collecting images, and only later I decided to dedicate this project to Wayland Rudd and actually call this project the Wayland Rudd Collection. As a gesture of respect, but a gesture of maybe commemoration of Wayland Rudd, a specific, Soviet American actor who kind of joined the Soviet experiment, right? Joined the Soviet society in early 1930s and stayed with, with the Soviet people, I guess, for the rest of his life. And I understand that, his story is also very complex, and his engagement with the Soviet Union is complex and contradictory. But I felt that he's not as well known as a figure to the Soviet people, but I guess in the US as well. So I felt, okay, if I am doing this new project, I should commemorate someone who may be forgotten, right? Or not well known. And I think his engagement with the Soviet experiment is very well, genuine, right? I mean, he was not visiting for a while and then coming back to the US, right? He moved to the Soviet Union for good and stayed there. So the project was given his name, right? The Wayland Rudd Collection as a commemorative gesture. So once I had this collection, as I mentioned, I felt, okay, it's too complex. I need to involve others to look at these images and react to these images, maybe create new artworks using these images in response to these images from the historical collection, in response to the historical Soviet images. And I wanted to invite contemporary artists and also scholars to sort through this collection and to do justice to the complexity of this overlap between the history of American communism and the history of African American communities. In 2013, there was an exhibition in New York called the Wayland Rudd Collection, and the exhibition included, of course, the historical artworks, the historical Soviet artworks that you can see currently at the JKC Gallery, but there were also contemporary responses by artists. Contemporary artists, American artists, post-Soviet artists. And one of the artists in the exhibition was Kara Lynch, who is with us today. And as I was preparing this exhibition, the Wayland Rudd Collection, in which Kara also participated, I learned that Kara had an earlier project developed in late 90s, early 2000s, in the former Soviet Union. I guess at that point, maybe it was still, no, it was already post-Soviet Union. It was a film called Black Russians, and I would love Kara to talk about it and also maybe connect it to the exhibition in 2014.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Yevgeniy. So as you shared, I directed and produced, I would say, an experimental documentary called Black Russians, which looks at or follows the lives of African descendant folks who are living in, at that moment, was a new Russia in the early 90s. And I was interested, approaching this project, I was really interested in the transition from the Soviet Union to this new Russia, and through the experience of kind of a microcosm and this group of people who were African descendant, and thinking about what this change would mean for Black people living there, and then also Black people globally. And I guess I'll share how I came to the project. I'll sort of follow your mode. So I, as a college student, studied Russian. And as I was failing, I realized that I might do better at learning this language by being in an immersive situation. So I applied to a study abroad program in Moscow, and I was there in the spring of 1989, which now we know is portentous, but at the time it wasn't fully known, but it also felt like a very hopeful time there. That was my experience. So I was in a group of about 7 or 8 students. It was hosted by Dartmouth University, and we were hosted by the biology department of MGU, or Moscow State University. We studied for that entire spring, and we were studying language. We were all language students, but our contemporaries who would also do an exchange in the US in the summer, they were all scientists, and they were interested in environmental studies, which was something that people there were very curious about, and yet there wasn't really a discipline. So we also studied ecology and environmental studies in the Soviet Union as language students. So I spent 4 months there as a college student, and one of the things that really surprised me was that at Moscow State University, which is huge, it's like being in a city itself, I saw all of these students from all over the world, and many people from the African continent, also from the Caribbean, all over Asia. And at the time, I felt like nobody had told me that this was going on, that there were people from all over the world studying in the Soviet Union. And also at the time, there were 2 films that came out that were Soviet films produced, but for a foreign audience in many ways. One was Asa, which is maybe you could explain it later, but it it has, it deals with some questions around mixed race identity within a film that's kind of around a rock group, and like young people. So it's about, the lives of young people, but through a band. And there are some issues around, one of the characters is mixed race and black. And then there was another film, Malenkaya Vera, Little Vera, that really did well in the foreign market. And it absolutely dealt with issues around race and the mixed race children in the Soviet Union, within kind of a dystopian setting. And from seeing that it was a topic that Soviets were interested in dealing with, I also felt like it was open terrain for myself to take on as somebody of African descent who has a relationship with the place. And I was then also encouraged by former faculty members in the Russian department to follow this up. And so I made this wild proposal in 1993 to go to Moscow, make a documentary about Black people there with no contacts and not a lot of experience making documentary, but I was a video artist, so I had something. And I received this travel grant from the Lila Wallace Foundation to spend 6 months in Moscow in 1994 to 95, and was hosted by, I guess it's now what Marat's gallery is, but the Contemporary Art Center, and by TV Gallery, to see if I could make this project. And that's how I landed in Moscow again in 1994 to start Black Russians. And what I ended up focusing on in the project, from who I met and what I learned on the ground, I focused on kind of 3 groups, and I made this really strong decision eventually that I was only going to, this project was going to be about people who were living in the former Soviet Union, in this new Russia, in the 90s, at the time that I went there. I was going to share some of the history and the legacy, but I was really going to concentrate on people who this was their lived experience at this time. So that meant folks who were of an older generation at the time. They were in their 60s, 50s, and 60s, who had, one of their parents had been one of these African Americans who had come in the 20s, 30s, 40s to the Soviet Union and had married and had children, and they themselves had lived there. So this is one generation, and those folks are people like James Patterson, Ina and Ella Ross. And then the next group were folks who were of a younger generation, also African descent, mixed race, and they were more my age and younger. And their parents had been from mostly the African continent, some from Cuba as well, and they would be labeled by Russians as festivalny. So folks who their parents had come to study in the Soviet Union from the late 50s onward, not only at Patrice Lumumba University, but all over the Soviet Union. And then the third group were current students who were from all over the African continent, the Caribbean. I met many students from all over the world, but I concentrated on folks who are African descendant. So looking at their current experience and all the while trying to understand what is this new Russia going to look like and feel like, and learn from them. We do have a clip of like a trailer that maybe we could look at, and then I can say a little bit more.
Yeah, so I'm going to cue that up. Okay, and here we go.
Когда это была не Россия, а Союз Советских Социалистических Республик, когда это было мощное тоталитарное государство, то есть тема расизма, естественно, была закрыта, потому что не было такой темы. То есть нет у нас расизма, не может быть расизма в стране Советов, там не может быть дискриминации в стране Советов. У нас все равны, у нас все хорошо. И поэтому было сложно жить таким людям, что на поверку-то на самом деле в практике они каждый день сталкивались с расизмом, с дискриминацией. Они каждый день сталкивались с тем, что они изгои, что их общество вышвыривает просто из... Но официально этого не существовало.
Внешне никто меня за русского человека не считает. Я становлюсь для кого-то русским, когда я говорю с ним, что-то мы делаем, понимаешь? Тогда он говорит, да, это парень русский. Он отличается от меня только цветом кожи, и все. А так он вырос, он, понимаешь, всю жизнь здесь.
Для меня, что я русский гражданин, так получилось. Так получилось, что я родился в России.
America was portrayed as a place that discriminated against black people in every sense of the word. And Russians are trying to be Americans in every sense of the word. And so if we're going the American way, then we cannot go halfway. We must go 100%.
So yeah, I think that trailer gives you a sense that some of how I was approaching it at the time was to really get a sense of how people understood race, how people understood blackness, and also how people understood Russianness in this post-Soviet moment. And I was also really curious about community and whether folks felt like they did have community. So these were some of the tensions that came up in the project. And you know, I made friends in some ways, but I wouldn't say it was the easiest. I will just share a couple of the threads or lines of narration within the project because I think this links to the Wayland Rudd project, in that where I think this piece is not a traditional documentary is one that I wanted to create a conversation between the people that I was speaking with. They might not have been in community with each other, but I heard these overlapping concerns from folks. And so in the documentary, as a viewer, you have an opportunity to hear all of these sides of the stories as though they're having a conversation with each other because they had a conversation with me. The other threads are, so I had sort of three very strong narrative voices. One was Langston Hughes from his book, I Wonder as I Wander, and his travels to the Soviet Union. And as an anchor point and as this lineage of Black Americans going like Wayland Rudd, in order to see what it might be like to be in a place where there had not been a history of transatlantic slavery, not a history of colonialism of Black people. What would that look like for them? How could they participate or contribute? The other voice is my own personal narrative, because it seemed really clear that I had a trajectory, having been there in '89 and now in the mid-'90s, and what it was for me to move through the space. So there is a personal narrative thread through. And then there's sort of an official, it's not really an official history, but it's more like these are some historical facts that might help and give context. And it's from a Black perspective, which isn't comfortable for everybody. And I'm not a historian, but it is based on the research. And then I would say there's Pushkin's poetry that is also a line within the piece. And that's so much because pretty much every time I would introduce my project to people while I was in Moscow or St. Petersburg, or very small towns, invariably people would either begin to recite Pushkin or they would tell me Pushkin was Black. And this became this kind of running theme. And so I started to ask all of the folks who I spoke to share Pushkin with us. So Gira, he reads a very beautiful poem. James Patterson. Anyway, it was a part of it. And then another kind of thread actually is Soviet film, which is this one film, Cirque or Circus, becomes a framing for arriving in this place and how race is going to unravel for us. And so, and I would say, like, that's where I see a link between your engagement, Yevgeniy, with seeing that Black people globally's relationship with the Soviet Union also is running alongside of this development of Soviet art. And I think that somebody could do that work of like, what are all the films? How would you make sense of it? And there are some montages in Black Russians that take segments of films from the 20s until the 1990s, where there are Black characters and kind of pushing against how race is depicted. Yeah, I think that's what I could share. I was thinking about, as a participant in the exhibition, I remember having a very hard time figuring out, which poster artwork that I was going to respond to, and I don't even know if I landed on any, but I did. What I ended up sharing was what I called a Russian journal, and I include some artifacts from my archive, from my visits there, but I also revisited some material from Black Russians that had been like a teaser to get money for the project. And also this conversation that I had before I even left the US to go, I cold called, back before we had cell phones and when there were phone books, I called Yelena Khanga, because she was kind of the most famous Afro-Russian that anybody knew of. She had written a book about her family's trajectory as Black people in the Soviet Union, and she was already on TV by then. Did she have the show Что это by then? I don't remember. Anyway, but so she had just done a tour in the U.S. for the book around her family. And I called her and I told her about the project, and I asked her if she was interested in, contributing or supporting, and if she had any thoughts about, if she could put me in contact with anybody. And she was not very interested in supporting the project at the time. And what she said to me was, well, when you get to Moscow, you'll see Black people in the street and you should talk to them. And so I did that. At the time it was very demoralizing, right? As she's telling me this on the phone, but I was like, okay, that's what we're doing. And, in the end, her advice actually was, fine enough. And I did, just introduce myself to people. But I will say, I do want to put a shout out to Nina Zaretskaya for just having always been an incredible support with TV Gallery for this project. Like, would have been a totally different project. So Russian Journal, I just want to point to this poster, because I think this is actually the poster that I should have responded to. So I'll do my best to read it. So, Druga я никогда не забуду, если с ним подращился. Yeah?
Повстречался.
Подружился в Москве. So I'll never forget a friend that I make in Moscow.
Perfect. Thank you, Kara. Thank you very much. So the exhibition was in 2013, right? 2013, so it's already been 13 years, I guess. So as I was preparing for the exhibition, I met Maxim Matusevich for the first time. I think we had the meeting in New York as I was preparing for the exhibition, because I knew that as a historian he has written on the encounters between Africa and the Soviet Union, and about African American visitors to the Soviet Union and expats in the Soviet Union. And after the exhibition, I started working on this book, the Wayland Rudd Collection, which took about 6 years to put together, and it includes, of course, the historical images. There are in this book the images from the 2013 exhibition, the Wayland Rudd Collection, but there are also a group of texts or a group of essays that I've invited historians and writers to contribute, and Maxim is one of the contributors to the book, and I think your research was very important for me as I was starting my research. So I would love you to give us a little bit of kind of historical background of these images and the history of African American expats in the Soviet Union.
Thank you, and I think I'll walk over very carefully.
Okay, so we're doing a little change of seating here, and I'll bring that up for you. Okay. Here we go. We'll start that. Oops, wait, that's the wrong one. There we go.
That's the one.
Yeah. Okay, so
we have to get to the beginning.
Oh, sure. Yep.
Okay.
So you could just use those.
Right.
All right. Let me just make sure we're broadcasting. Yep. Okay. Here's that.
Okay. Thank you so much, and thank you, Zhenya, Kara. It's really it's a special feeling to be here, because it's been 12, 13 years since Zhenya hosted that event in Manhattan, and the book came out, and it seems like so many things have shifted and changed in our lives. But it's interesting that now in 2026, revisiting that story feels poignant. And this probably has a lot to do with the world outside of us, which has also shifted in the last 13 years. As I was preparing for today's event, I went back to that little essay I wrote for Zhenya's book, and once again ended up thinking about Paul Robeson, because the essay was inspired by one of the images of Paul Robeson that were ubiquitous in the Soviet Union when I was growing up, and sort of trying to think back and trying to understand why I was so connected to this topic in the first place. And I think for me, I'm historian of the Cold War, historian of Africa and the history of encounters, as was mentioned before, between Africa, race, blackness, and the Soviet experiment and the Soviet experience. And I think this is such a 20th century story. And I think it's also a universal story, right? It's not only African story, it's not just Soviet or Russian story. It really is a universal story because it's a story of very difficult moral choices. It's a story of personal frustrations writ large and kind of mapped on the canvas of history, which is much larger than all of us, right? And and Paul Robeson for me, the great New Jersey, and we're in the state of New Jersey, the great New Jersey, Paul Robeson, he's sort of centered, right? He's right at the center of the intersection of all those powerful historical forces that really shaped so many of us. I mean, the fact that we're all here right now is the product in many ways of those historical trajectories. So Paul Robeson was very much present in my life when I was growing up. And I know it was very much present in the lives of other Soviet children my age, Zhenya, I assume as well. He was a symbol of a kind of country that the country claimed to the world it was and wanted to be. And we liked that idea, right? It was the country that stood up against racism. It was the country that championed decolonization. There were a few very highly symbolic figures. Angela Davis was another one. And it's really always very interesting for me to talk about those personalities and those life stories to my students here in the United States, American students, who the vast majority of them never heard those names. And I always found that bizarre. Because you could ask anyone in the street, who is Paul Robeson or who is Angela Davis in the 1970s, and you would immediately get an answer because we grew up surrounded by those larger-than-life figures and personalities. And I just kept thinking about why is it that the country that produced those individuals, the country that produced those political but also cultural icons, doesn't really know them, while we, thousands of miles away, did grow up surrounded by those stories. And to answer this question, we really have to go back in time, right? We have to go back to this encounter between the Soviet Union and, Black America, but also the colonial world. The general outline of the story is well known, and basically that presents, that makes for a kind of context, the backdrop to the essay that I wrote for the book. But it is the story of a new country emerging within the realm of the former Tsarist Empire, Russia, after the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution, and the country that is so different from anything else that happened before, right? It's a country that aspires to become really this paragon of something fundamentally new in human experience. And one of very important elements of that novelty was the relationship to race. That is in the context of the colonial world, in the context of Jim Crow America, in the context of American racism. There is this new place which is different. And this was an acknowledged and often professed idea by the regime, right? So if you look at the 1920s and I would say early 1930s, this is really one of the foundational elements of the Soviet ideology, we're opposed to racism, we're opposed to imperialism. Imperialism is really the last final stage of capitalism, according to Lenin, the founder of the Soviet state, and will address those issues, those sins of the West. And you can see that in the kind of cultural production that comes out of the Soviet Union. Kara mentioned the famous film Circus. So here is a still from the Circus with the great Soviet actress Lyubov Orlova, so famous that, and the story is very sort of, we grew up with that story. It's a story of redemption. It's a story of the Soviet Union serving as the savior of the downtrodden, right? And the place where people are on equal footing. It's a story of a white American circus performer who comes to the Soviet Union with a black child because she had had a relationship with an African American back in the States. And she's pursued by this really nefarious capitalist, racist circus owner, the capitalist, right? Who thinks that on the one hand he pursues this actress, he pursues this blonde woman who has a dark secret. She has this mixed race child, and he thinks that he can blackmail her. That the moment he reveals her secret to the Soviet audiences, they'll be horrified. And there is this culmination in the film where the audiences are not horrified. The audience think that this is wonderful and there is no problem. And this becomes this kind of like statement of, claim to, anti-racism, which really is foundational to the Soviet ideology. And, of course, you can see that in art, pieces like this painting I found at New York Public Library. I was not able to find the artist. I'm sure it's probably possible if you Google image. The imagery of the Soviet postcard, which showcases racial solidarity and inclusion, as we would say today, and of course the famous Langston Hughes, the great bard of Harlem Renaissance, who in 1932 traveled to the Soviet Union with a group of other artists and sort of young African-American intelligentsia to make a film, propaganda, anti-racist film that actually never got made. But what Langston Hughes got out of the trip was the experience, really very deep experience of this new country. He traveled the breadth of it. He went to Central Asia. Here you can see dressed up as an Uzbek peasant. He left those wonderful memoirs about the trip, in which he claimed that he had found this new place, this new country, which really was different from anything you would find in the West. And of course, the country engaged in successive campaigns, of anti-racist activism, and again expressed through propaganda, but also through mass movements. When the Scottsboro boys were put on trial, falsely accused of sexual assault, the whole country went out to the streets, and of course, a lot of this was choreographed and organized. But again, like American racism as Western racism in general, and the predations in the colonies, it was kind of propaganda gift that kept on giving, right? That the Soviets didn't have to invent stuff. All they had to do was just to address very real issues, the very real blemishes of the West, and they, of course, did it. So we have generations of Soviet children, for example, consuming that kind of cultural production, consuming that kind of mass movements expressed through demonstrations or protest marches. So this really became part of the narrative. It's not the whole story, by the way, but this became part of the narrative that really became the narrative of several generations of Soviet school children. And this was the context into which Paul Robeson entered in late 1934. He took a train from he took a steamship to Hamburg, then he traveled to Berlin, and from Berlin he took a train to the Soviet Union. And there is this very harrowing moment that he describes in his, that is described in one of his biographies, where he spends a couple of hours pacing on the platform in Berlin, and this is late 1934. So the Nazis are already there. And he watches, those black uniforms, and, he's getting all these dirty looks. And apparently this was a very traumatic experience. He gets on the train at Friedrichstrasse railway station, you can see here, and travels across the border to the Soviet Union. And by crossing the border, he always claimed he entered a different world. It was a world where there was no racism, according to him. It was a world where he could exhale, because he couldn't exhale while he was pacing on that platform in Berlin, because he really felt that just anything could happen to him on the account of the color of his skin. In Moscow, at the railway station, he was met with flowers and with the orchestra, and Soviet school children were there, anxious to hug him and to make him welcome. And he wrote in one of the letters home that it was so cold in Moscow. Of course, this is Christmas time, I think, close to New Year's, 1934, but he felt it was warm, right? And he's booked into one of the fanciest hotels, actually in the same room, at least according to Robson later on, that had been previously given to the first American ambassador in Moscow. And I think that's probably possibly what happened, because in symbolic terms, this was a very powerful gesture, right? Like here you have this great African-American artist who is, is still facing discrimination back home, but here he can reside in the in the suite that had been previously given to the American ambassador. So for us, there is no difference. And that trip to Moscow really became really central to his personal odyssey. He falls in love with the country. He falls in love, I would say, not just with the Soviet Union, but with the multiplicity of ethnic minorities in the Soviet Union, including, interestingly, Jews. A lot of his Soviet friends are Jewish artists and Jewish intelligentsia. Here you can see him with a couple of them, prominent theater director and poets, writers, artists. He became very close with them. And for him, there was this connection to the Soviet experience through Jewish experience, through Black experience, which all merged together, because all those threads, they kind of presented to Paul Robson this new country that was so fundamentally different, from the prejudiced realm of the West that he left. And by all accounts, the affection that he felt for the Soviet Union was genuine. In the archives you can literally find hundreds and hundreds of letters by Soviet school children to Paul Robson. They call him Dядя Paul, Uncle Paul, right? Affectionately. He's really kind of adopted into this wider Soviet family. He visited Arte, the famous pioneer camp in Crimea, and he really became like beloved figure for Soviet children. This larger-than-life iconic figure who really was a father figure. So I just said the Soviet children adopted him, but in a way they adopted him as their father, which is kind of an interesting twist. Here is an example of one of numerous letters, Paul Viliaminovich. So they patronymic, I'm not even sure, they introduced his second name as a patronymic, which the Russians would do, Paul Viliaminovich. And again, the intensity of that relationship between Paul Robson and the Soviet society really was very interesting. And again, I would like to stress that it was real. The affection, by all accounts, the affection was mutual and it was real. And then the Cold War arrives. And this launches a very new period in this relationship, I would say. For many reasons, one, that there is this new global context, there is this confrontation, open hostility between, two superpowers after the war, and the ideological divide is very serious. And Paul Robson quite clearly is facing a challenge, right? Because he's still very much attached to the Soviet Union. But that attachment during the war, it was not a problem, right? Because the Soviets and Americans were allies. But all of a sudden, it becomes really problematic from the point of view of the US State Department. In 1949, Paul Robeson travels to Paris to the World Peace Conference, and he gives that famous speech where he says that African Americans would never fight against the Soviets, which again, you know, may not sound like a particularly controversial thing to say now, but at the time, you know, at the height of the Cold War, this was a fairly controversial statement to make. Within a few months, the State Department revokes his passport. For the next 8 years, 9 years, Paul Robeson cannot travel. He loses livelihood, you know, because before he was a very famous artist, in high demand, you know, theater actor, performer, singer, but now he really doesn't have access to livelihood is very limited now. So he really becomes a hostage in this Red Scare drama. And here arrives, in my opinion, this really difficult moral thing, you know, because he's a hostage of this enormous historical forces. And he's a victim of those historical forces. And he has to make some very difficult, as I understand it, moral choices for himself. Particularly because the Soviet Union, while all those things were happening, you know, also had to underwent certain metamorphoses, like from this kind of early proletarian internationalist utopia of the 1920s, it had really turned into a nation state. And during the Second World War, during this joint fight against fascism, we have something else happening in the Soviet Union, the rise of Russian nationalism, which is very much nurtured by Stalin and harnessed by Stalin for his war purposes, war goals. At the same time, we have the growing persecution of various ethnic minorities, Crimean Tatars and the Chechens and the English and the Volga Germans, and eventually Jews after the war. So the second half of the 1940s, especially after 1948, until Stalin's death, we have this campaign against cosmopolitanism, so-called cosmopolitanism, which is essentially a rabid anti-Semitic campaign, which claims the lives of quite a few people, usually people of culture, people of the art world, including most of Paul Robeson's close friends. And I always, as a historian and a fiction writer, I'm drawn to this kind of moral conundrums, right, that many of us have to face in our lives, you know, if we live long enough and if we pay attention, right? How did he handle that? How did he address those kind of controversies and really terrible moral dilemmas? Because on the one hand, the reality of racism is real in America. Jim Crow is real. The frustration with the state that goes after your livelihood and after your dignity is real. On the other hand, the state that you think is the better, is the safeguard against fascism, against racism, against imperialism, is killing your friends, right? And is, you know, waging this campaign of purges which would claim the lives of hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people. How you reconcile, how you navigate that. And I think he never resolved this issue, in my opinion. It was always very difficult. Here you can see an example of, you know, almost every person in this photograph will be executed. And more than half of them are close friends of Paul Robeson, right? Here you can see a cartoon from Crocodile from 1953, the height of the so-called Doctor's Plot, which was kind of the high watermark of the anti-Jewish campaign. Again, how you deal with this. And then 1956, Khrushchev's secret speech, which opened up for the first time the story of the purges and the horrible fate that visited so many people, including many of the close friends of Paul Robeson. And then that October, the invasion of Budapest, right? And the suppression of the Hungarian rebellion, which was very bloody on both sides, by the way. How you respond to this? How you respond to the fact that millions of people are in the Gulag, But at the same time, you're convinced, as Paul Robeson was, that if you remove this one actor from the global equation, the Soviet Union, the world will implode. It'll collapse into the fascist conflagration. It was a very heartfelt and genuine and real conviction. So when I look at Paul Robeson, and when I think back my own childhood, when Paul Robeson was the icon that we all looked up to, and who was omnipresent, who was, he sang our favorite songs, his voice really became kind of the backdrop to some of our favorite childhood experiences. He could drink good vodka, right? With his friends in Russia. He could recite Pushkin's poetry. He was also like a very talented, linguistically talented person. He spoke fairly good Russian. I always thought that was exaggerated until I listened to the tapes. He's not bad at all. He learned Yiddish because, as I mentioned before, for him there was conflation of Russian and Jewish culture in a very interesting way. So there is that, and then there are these moral dilemmas, right, that he had to face. So for me, this is the story of the 20th century. This is the story of a really remarkable person of enormous stature. He was a big guy, but also enormous moral stature, and enormous person who was not indifferent to the pain, right? Who nevertheless had to face really terrible 20th century moral dilemmas. And again, and I think, to bring it up today, I think that's the time in our lives when we may have to face those dilemmas, right? That we live in a very sort of concentrated historical period where maybe not to this extent, not yet, thank God, but we have to face very hard, difficult moral dilemmas. And that's why the experience and the example of Paul Robeson continues to be so relevant. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maxim. Super. Thank you, Maxim. Thank you, Kara. And I'm wondering, Michael, do you have some questions? I think you
I
have
do.
some ideas.
I just have one question, actually, but I need to just get everybody. Hi, there's me. I need to get the camera's back on. I'll just go to the big camera here for the three of you. There you go. You're on.
Okay, great.
I think just picking up on where you were leaving off, for everyone here, where do you see, or have you considered sort of where we are now in the world in terms of having done the research and thought about this and been part of this show and thinking about immigration or thinking about racism, thinking about a country that is dealing with whether or not it wants to be this very nationalistic, singular race, or it wants to invite people into its country. Like, where do you, has it sort of given you a different perspective or understanding about where we are now, in this country in particular?
I think I would love to pass it to
a historian.
Yes, to an artist or historian. I do see it. I mean, I personally see. I'm not sure if I see. I kind of see this project in a way as a project from 2013, right? And the book came out in 2021. So when Michael was asking this question, I was kind of not sure I can connect it quickly to the present. I guess I see it more as a historical group of historical images that maybe need to be reactivated one more time as I did in 2013, right? Maybe with involvement of contemporary artists again. Right, but personally, I feel I would like to find out how they connect to 2026. But I feel it has to be a collective effort, right? So I don't have a good answer for Michael how this connects now to how this work connects to 2026.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I guess that's the work of the artists to engage with. I mean, I agree with you. It would need to be like a collective engagement. But I appreciate, Maxime, your framing of, the Soviet Union and how someone like Paul Robeson and others of his generation were approaching it as this new place, a new opportunity, a new country, with very specific goals around race, ethnicity, colonialism. What's hard now is that feels so far away. If I think about Russia, it's so far away. And then thinking about the United States in terms of what are the goals or understandings around what it means to be a country with values and what are the values. I think there's like the knee jerk is democracy, and we all understand what that means. And yet we experience daily how extremely different people define democracy. Yeah, so I just think, I think what I appreciate about these posters is like that there is this visual culture of how to get this message across. And then I think of like, what are examples that I could think of, let's say in the current moment, of a group of people trying to get as strong a message across. So, I think like I've seen a lot of zines that people are putting out around, mostly around ICE, support. Those seem to be very bold images that might tell us something about this current moment. I wish that I saw more strong images that are anti-war and about peace, internationally, and like coming from here. Yeah, these are the things that come up for me. Yeah.
Well, I think it's eerily relevant, actually, for a number of reasons. So one of the lessons I took away from not just Paul Robeson's story, but I've researched quite a few of those life stories, and they're really, as they say, as my students would say, I could relate to many of them on a very personal level. It is that sometimes we look for, search for salvation in places that are not perfect. And we find it there, right? Or we find redemption. And how you deal with this. And, we can talk about this when we talk about people like Langston Hughes or Paul Robeson or Angela Davis later on. But we can also talk about people who would leave the Soviet Union in the late 1980s, early 1990s, and come to the United States, for example, right? And would really make it here, right? And because of the success of their personal journey, of their personal transition, from that place to this place, and because they did find what they were hoping to find in so many cases, they would become really blind and oblivious to the many flaws of this society, for example. And I think here we're dealing with a very human story. You know, that's what I find most appealing about this. You know, it's not just about ideology. It really is about a human experience. You know, can we be happy, or can we be redeemed in a place which oppresses others, right? You know, or which makes life difficult for others. And again, it works both ways. Both ways. So that's one issue that I think is still very much relevant. I don't think it'll go away anywhere anytime soon. And the second, it's this whole thing about mobility and you know, sort of the immigrant experience with capital I, you know, which I think again is a very human experience. You know, this ability to move around, this ability to travel, this ability to get from point A to point B is really very central, I think, to our personal sense of personal freedom. And when that ability is being regulated or circumscribed, or when we're prevented from exercising that human right of being able to be mobile, you know, we really begin to lose something that's very central to our sense of self-worth, right? So, and here, you know, there is a reason why all these people, why Langston Hughes and Claude McKay and Paul Robson, and you can go down the list, there is a reason why they were so obsessed with travel, why being able to travel was so important to them. Because being able to travel, being able to move, to be mobile, is really central to feeling free, right? And that's why when we look around and see that people are prevented from doing this, or you know, there are powerful forces that want to plant people strictly in one particular place. And sort of like we grew up in the Soviet Union. We were not allowed to travel, right? And that was a source of great frustration. So I think this is another issue that continues to be relevant. And that's why these stories and these images are still very much with us.
Yeah, come on up. Here. All right, here. I'll bring the microphone to you so we can hear your question.
I don't have a question.
Oh, whatever you need to say.
Okay. A lot has been said here tonight that is extremely pertinent to the Black experience. This is an amazing exhibit. Okay, so for me, I am 69 years old. So I came up in an era where my pop didn't talk too much about but my mother did, because she was from the South. And looking at my pop's experience, it was a little different because his great-grandmother was South African, Dutch, and Scottish, because of the experience coming from an island that they actually lived on, and there's a stamp of her. Yeah. So going through that experience and ending up in Philadelphia and becoming Catholic. So in my family, they're Black Catholics, and I'm from African American Episcopal Zion. So my framework is from a biblical sense. So looking at the 20s, which is a little bit different in America, there were Black communities that were very vibrant, but it's the Jim Crow that you pointed out that began to put us together. But actually, because we were doing so well in the 20s, we had Black Wall Street, we had the South, and all of those cities actually were very viable because Blacks were separated from whites, unfortunately, because of, you know, the separation and denigration of humanity. But that's all biblical, because it's like Esau and Jacob, to separate the people biblically. And we come into today. So Paul Robeson, my granddaughter goes to school in Princeton. So when I drive to the Lewis School at Princeton, Paul Robeson, is that the street, Chrisal, that's next to the Y that I see every day? So when I think of Langston Hughes, because her cousin is named after him, I think that the artist when you look at America, so when we come up to today, the separation that existed and the freedom that I did not know, and probably a lot of other people did not know existed in the Soviet Union, because we're always looking at Germany and the hatred that was created from Minecraft with Hitler. So we never look at, but I do recall in the 80s, because my ex-husband was in the military. So in the military and with artists, did you see, because my ex-husband never said there were problems when he was in Germany. He actually, you know, he had good experiences in the late 80s and the beginning. He wasn't there in the 90s, but you're telling me the 90s was in the Soviet Union was a good experience, like a melting pot, so to speak. Is that
Complicated. It was a complicated time. It was complicated.
There were multiplicity of races that were there. It wasn't just, and there was a sense of freedom.
This is the thing, is that I think by the 90s, that's the tension, is that the how people were raised, you know, that Maxime talks about being raised with this idea that there is no racism in the Soviet Union, everybody is on equal footing, but at the same time, what they feel is that there is racial prejudice, there is chauvinism, there are restrictions on where they can be. So to live a different experience than what you're being taught or told, which is interesting because in the US, as Black people, we also have that experience.
Right, we do have that experience in 2026, but in a different way. So me as a person, I call myself an Israelite, right? So me as an Israelite, think a little differently. So when I see that this is a melting pot now, different than it was in the 50s and 60s. So today, I see all the different nations coming in, and as a person that was already here, it looks like we're being replaced when you have the different, and this happens over time. So they bring immigrants into America, and then that makes the jobs for the Black people who are here less, right? Okay, so coming up to today, we do have these challenges, but you know, it's my aspiration that eventually, as 12 tribes that are in the Bible, we start to talk to each other and work together so that we can have a cohesiveness to move forward and get away from the small-mindedness, because we're supposed to be good to one another. But sometimes when you have people who want to focus on a negative suppression, depression, then you don't have that loving your neighbor. But eventually, hopefully, with this kind of exhibit and these kind of talks in Princeton, because they will be appreciated to have some kind of fundraiser where we could, you know, come in and have this wonderful experience that I'm having right now. It's something to consider, because I think the nation needs to see this and experience this and know that those kind of things existed in the past, and we need to bring it forward and have people know in 2026 and move forward.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, everyone.
Wow, this is such a beautiful coda.
Thank you. Yes. All right. Thank you to our panel. Thank you for everyone who attended. Thank you for everyone who watched. And
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thank you, Michael.
Thanks, everyone.